frank and revealing encounter now on BBC Two, poet and 60s beat legend Allen Ginsberg comes face to face with Jeremy Isaacs. Some of the language may cause offence.
Allen Ginsberg, you are America's best-known poet. You were a key figure of the Beat generation with Kerouac and Burroughs. Now the beard and the hair are trim. You wear a suit and a collar and a tie. Just brought out a new volume, Cosmopolitan Greetings. But is the real Allen Ginsberg still in there?
Though I'm a Buddhist, and I think the Buddhists would say there is no real permanent self in any case, but there are many appearances of self. So I'm certainly a beat poet, and I'm certainly Jewish, and I'm certainly gay, and I'm certainly an American, and I'm certainly a practicing meditator. And I suppose a part of the counterculture in America, which is now under attack by the neoconservative theopolitical televangelists who are denouncing the McGovernick counterculture and threatening war on it. So I don't know if there is a real Allen Ginsberg any more than there might be a real Jeremy Isaacs.
You're a member, you say, of the counterculture. In the bohemia of New York in the mid-50s, you lived, you almost grew up in an atmosphere of drink and drugs and gay sex and some violence.
Not that much violence. After all, we were more anti-war, and I've not been so much involved with violence as in pacifist activity. But certainly drink. Some friends drank. I never did. Drugs, I've tried almost everything, but I'm more of a workaholic, so I never was addicted to anything except the killer drug, nicotine, which I quit many years ago because I have high blood pressure, among other reasons. But I've had friends who've been in trouble.
And friends who, there were deaths among your friends, and
yes,
violent deaths among your friends.
Some, but, you know, I think we have an actuarial average above normal. After all, William Burroughs is 80 years old and very productive. Herbert Huncke, who was, I'd say, the original beat personage, is approaching 80, or is 80 already, and still writing, and has just been in England, I believe. And Gary Snyder is thriving as a 60-year-old, myself. And Philip Whalen is now the abbot of the Hartford Street Zen Center in San Francisco. So, and Peter Orlovsky is...
And you're sitting in front of me.
And Gregory Corso's around, writing as beautifully as ever.
But what was the attraction of that very outré bohemian lifestyle?
Well, you know, Bohemia is a very old lifestyle. You had it in Bloomsbury. You had it in, with mixed sex, of course, in Bloomsbury, which was one of the attractions. That it was possible to be gay without having to be ashamed of it in that generation, in that community. Burroughs was gay, I was gay, Kerouac was straight, Neil Cassidy, a friend, was straight but willing to sleep with me. So there was a sort of tolerance, what Keats would call negative capability, the ability to hold opposing ideas in the mind without an irritable reaching after fact and reason. The key there is irritable. It's sort of a sense of tolerance.
It wasn't long before in your poems, in Howl, for example, you were able and willing to make explicit statements about your sexuality.
Yes.
Wasn't that very difficult in what was, after all, McCarthy's America?
Well, it would have been if I had intended it to be public, but to tell you the truth, and as I've said before, Howl was written sort of in despair at writing poetry. I figured I hadn't succeeded in writing anything interesting. And so I said, well, then I'll just writing for myself, and I'll forget about any idea of publishing poetry. And so I started writing, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, and I went on to catalog a series of almost grotesque, ironic, mocking, serious, sincere, trompe l'oeil, psychologically or mythological gossip that I'd heard of. And when it got to my own, got fucked in the ass by handsome sailors and screamed with joy, rather than screamed with pain or agony, I realized how funny it was, but I knew that my father would not want to read that. So from then on, I knew I wouldn't be able to publish the poem. And so I was completely free to write anything I wanted. And if you don't show anybody, you can do anything you want. That's the funny part. Which is why the poem is good, because it was written for my own privacy. Later on, people saw the manuscript and liked it, and then I gave a reading in which I thought would be like a small, private, arty reading in a small art gallery with other poets, Kerouac and Gary Snyder, among others. And everybody liked the poem, so I said, well, I guess it's all right then. But then I still was hesitant to publish it because of I didn't want my father to read the gay, explicit imagery. But finally I sent it to him. And he wrote me back a very interesting letter, Louis Ginsberg, being a poet, saying, this is a great poem full of energy and exuberance, but do you need all those blue words? So I explained to him, well, the way it passed through my head, and he got used to it.
When it was published, it was prosecuted for obscenity.
Yes, I was not there in San Francisco when the customs seized it, and then when the juvenile vice squad intruded on city lights and arrested the poet Ferlinghetti for publishing it. I was already in Tangier with Jack Kerouac and Peter Orlovsky and William Burroughs, helping type and assemble the manuscript of Naked Lunch. And I thought that was much more important than going back to fight a temporary little local trial, because if I won, well, I won. If I lost, I won anyway. And the poem would be sought after by generations if it were forbidden. So I couldn't lose either way. And Ferlinghetti said it was not necessary to come back.
And in fact, a rather good judgment by the judge found for you.
Yeah, legally, very interesting judgment. I don't know if they have that in England. You know, the Bloomsbury group, Roger Fry and Virginia Woolf, came out in defense of The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall, but they were not allowed to admit expert testimony as to its literary value. It was just whether it was obscene or not, and expert testimony was forbidden. In the Howell decision, Judge Horne said that questions of literary merit or beauty and questions of social critique are protected by the Constitution, and that established a precedent legally.
In writing Howell, you also found a form. You found what you described as open form rather than closed form to write verse in. Could you say something about that? What's the difference?
Well, it was a shift to cadences used idiomatically in ordinary speech. Some of that is in Zen, they speak of ordinary mind as the highest mind. So in a sense, highest mind. So in a sense, ordinary speech is the highest speech, in that there are phrases in idiomatic speech, vernacular speech, that penetrate in every direction aesthetically or intellectually, but are also commonly understood. Like the phrase, catch yourself thinking. Everybody knows what that means. And yet in esoteric Buddhism, it's the process of stopping your mind and observing the mind. In everyday barroom talk or pub talk, it might be, well, the other day I caught myself thinking of my mother-in-law. So it's a very good way of talking. It's something that Wordsworth proposed, a renovation of English diction 150 longer years ago, and that William Carlos Williams proposed in America, to break up the stanza and measure the spoken breath by breath stop, or measure the idea, or measure the length of the breath, or the or there would be equivalent to measure the length of the breath, or so you could have a relative measure, as William Carlos Williams, my mentor, called it.
Was Howell an angry poem about America?
I wouldn't say angry. There are certain aspects wrathful in judgment, but I'd say more exuberant, because, you know, the ultimate part is the peroration. At the end, I'm with you in Rockland, where you're madder than I am, but I'm with you. It's a gesture of sympathy to a friend who is in trouble, basically, with a certain amount of anguish in it. The ultimate accusation really is Moloch, whose name is the mind. It isn't, you know, out there, the all-devouring God. that the destroyer god, is not out there. It's our own imagination, as Blake pointed out. So Moloch, whose name is the mind, is hardly angry. That's a piece of wisdom teaching, actually, or something that I understood from Blake long ago.
Had you seen the best minds of your generation destroyed?
It's hyperbole.
You just rattled off half a dozen of them who are still with us.
Yes, well, it's hyperbole. There's a certain exaggeration there. I mean, the first verse originally went, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, mystical, naked. And I thought that was too sentimental, so I said starving, hysterical, naked. I did revise it that much to get some sense of distance and irony from it.
You speak of the need for candor in writing and making the private world public. That's what the poet does. Is that right? Is that what you do?
Yes, very consciously following the direction of my ultimate American mentor, Walt Whitman, who in 1855 early edition of Leaves of Grass said that he hoped that American poets would develop in the direction of candor, kind of inadvertent unmanipulative frankness, like spontaneous frankness.
To what degree was Whitman able, as you were, to be candid about his homosexuality?
Well, you know, it's amazing if you read the Calamus sections of Leaves of Grass, or even his Old Age Echoes, where he has to talk about his constipation. He was quite candid about his emotions. He wasn't candid about his physical loves, if he had any, although I slept with Neil Cassidy, who slept with the Gavin Arthur, the grandson of President Chester Arthur, who had slept with Edward Carpenter, who said that Edward Carpenter told him he had slept with Walt Whitman. So there's some kind of lineage of gossip there. But I don't think Whitman was able to proclaim the physical love in his poems, but he certainly proclaimed the emotional attachment in the Calamus sections.
In Kaddish, you mourn for your mother.
Yeah.
Tell me about her.
Well, my mother was a refugee from Russia in 1905. When she was about 8 years old, she came to America and had nervous breakdowns almost immediately. Married my father, who was born here of Russian parents. And then in the 30s, I remember visiting her in Sanitaria, where they had a cricket played on the lawn. Not cricket, but the little mallets and balls going through hoops. Yeah, croquet. Yeah. And as I grew up, I had to take care of her on and off, as my father was teaching in college. So when I was 9, 10, 12, 13, I visited her by myself in mental hospitals, which were grimy, huge, drab prisons in those days, where she'd had shock treatment, insulin and metrazole, and lobotomy and electroshock.
You actually signed the forms for her lobotomy,
yes,
is that right?
I was told later, when I was then 26 or so, that the doctors told me that she was in a state of such paroxysm and high blood pressure and anguish, banging her head literally against the wall, bloody, that if I didn't, they didn't take action, for which I'd have to sign, she might have a stroke. And rather naively believing what they had to say, I signed. So I've always felt enormous guilt and, but, you know, uncertainty about it.
What was the effect on you on living with a mother who was mad?
Well, it gave me a great sort of tolerance for eccentric behavior, certainly, and a kind of understanding of the varieties of suffering that people can go through, a variety of suffering she went through. I mean, she was called mad, but, you know, there were physiological concomitants, like she had a thing called hyperesthesia, where any sound, at one point, I remember, she'd lay in a darkened room, and any sound, any noise was painful physically. You know, like too much stimulation actually had some effect on raw nerves, maybe some, I've heard of it since, as there is synesthesia or cryptesthesia or dysesthesia, which I have, which is feeling lack in the foot soles because of diabetes. So I actually had to take care of her and had to deal with her irrationality, and sort of as a kid not knowing whether it was irrational or real, but having to negotiate it diplomatically. So it gave me a kind of, well, I would say an armoring. Difficult to get too pained. On the other hand, the lack love or the need for strong motherly affection remained intact in the heart, I think, and never does disappear. So there's always this longing for a feminine bliss, and at the same time fear of it, and so I'm gay in a sense.
In her sane episodes, she was a woman of very strong political opinions.
Yes, she claimed to be the secretary of the Patterson, New Jersey Communist Party cell. And Patterson was like a big red town, but the great strikes with John Reed in 1918 or so. Has a great labor history, actually. One interesting thing is that J. Edgar Hoover, who was a closet queen, destroyed the labor unions in America because they were originally formed by left-wing pinkos with political ambition, you know, to form a left in America. And in the destruction of the labor unions, the protected mafia protected by the FBI, of which Hoover was the head, moved into the vacuum when they purged all the unions of left-wing organizers that had started the unions. And that's why we have no labor or socialist party in America, where we have no left in America. We have the middle and the right now.
You also spent some time in your life in mental hospitals.
Yes, 1948, I think. Well, I'd had something like a visionary experience, or a hallucinatory experience, of hearing William Blake's voice reading The Sunflower, and The Sick Rose, and The Little Girl Lost. And something opened up in space for me. I don't know what it was, maybe ordinary mind. But I suddenly realized the endlessness of the skies and the exquisite work in the building sides and cornices of New York apartment houses. That maybe 50 years ago, Italian workmen had labored with intelligence to make all the scroll work and copper work on the roof combs. And so that kind of confused me as what I had seen, and I had no terms to think of it except Christian terms or Jewish terms, but monotheistic terms. I hadn't had any experience with the empty mind idea or Satori idea of Buddhism, and so I was quite confused about what was real and what was unreal. As Bob Dylan says, the princess and the prince discuss what's real and what is not. So I wound up with a group of friends who were robbers, and got busted with them, and it was a question of going to jail or going to the madhouse, as polite students do these days.
Tell me about the Blake experience, because that was a big thing. What happened?
Well, I just tried to give you a thumbnail sketch, but I don't know. It's sort of like an albatross. It was an ancient mariner, and he stopped with one of three. By thy long gray beard and thy glittering eye, wherefore stops thou me? BBC. It was a situation in which I was alone. I had had a love affair with Neil Cassidy, and he had gone off and gotten married, and I thought abandoned me. Burroughs, who was a close friend already for many years, was in New Orleans, and Kerouac had withdrawn to his house. And I was living in Harlem, East Harlem, New York, on the 6th floor of a tenement, with a lot of theological books around in an apartment I rented from a theology student friend. So I was reading a lot of Plato's Phaedrus, St. John of the Cross, and other books, and Blake. And I had the sudden, reading The Sick Rose and The Sunflower, I had the odd sensation of hearing Blake's voice outside of my own body, a voice really not too much unlike my own when my voice is centered in my sternum, maybe a latent projection of my own physiology, but in any case a surprise and apparent, maybe a hallucination you could call it, hearing it in the room, Blake reciting, or some very ancient voice of the Ancient of Days, reciting, "Ah, sunflower, weary of time, who countest the steps of the sun, seeking after that sweet golden clime where the traveler's journey is done, where the youth pined away with desire, and the pale virgin shrouded in snow arise from their graves and aspire where my sunflower wishes to go. So there was some earthen deep quality that moved me, and then I looked out the window and it seemed like the heavens were endless, or the sky was endless, I should say.
Did that help you become a poet?
Well, it was a very turning around experience. It was a very definitive experience, yeah. I don't know how to explain it, and I wouldn't assert it as a vision. I would say a hallucination, that's fine. But it certainly left an imprint on my nature.
You used drugs thereafter to try to recapture that hallucination,
well,
hallucinatory experience?
I had used drugs before, though in that period, that year, I wasn't. Drugs, but not drugs, dried herbs, marijuana, that's all. And I had, years later, I tried psychedelics. 3-4 years later, tried peyote to see if I could approximate the experience. And I think the psychedelic drugs do approximate some natural experience, but they aren't as ample, as grounded as a natural experience, if you can call my own Blake experience natural. At the time, actually, I was eating vegetables, I wasn't eating meat, and I was leading a solitary life, and sort of a beat in the sense of something I've heard recently from a folk singer, freedom's just another word for nothing more to lose. So my heart was open, in a sense, at the time.
Is the value of such an experience, which you must have sought over and over again with the different drugs that you used, is it the experience worthwhile in itself, or does it permanently help you to perceive an expanded universe?
Well, I think a natural experience permanently helps you to have a key to the fact that the universe is, in ordinary mind even, endless, beyond horizon. So it might wake you to that ordinary mind, as Zen people call it. The psychedelic experience, whether it's peyote or LSD or psilocybin or natural mushrooms, or as an extension of diet, might catalyze this very similar sense of infinity or expansiveness or panoramic awareness, you could call it, which you find in Wordsworth's sonnet on Westminster Bridge, or his moment on top when he steps out of the mists.
I don't think Wordsworth ever took.
No,
right.
But his friends did remember.
Yeah.
The Pneumatic Institute.
Sure.
The laughing gas. Sir Humphrey Davy, in the Lake Poets, were very interested in that. So he was familiar, and also familiar with Coleridge's experiments with laudanum. But the natural experience of expansive panoramic awareness can be catalyzed by the psychedelic drugs, and I think they're quite useful. I would recommend, however, people learn some meditative centering, sitting practice of meditation, in order to ground themselves so that they're not entangled in their own projections, in their imagination, not confused by the reality or unreality of what they think they see.
What does meditation do for you?
Well, it develops patience. I mean, if you have to sit there like this, following your breath, and noticing when your mind wanders, you get a profile both of your mind and some sense of the space around you, which might lead to that sense of panoramic awareness.
Do you do that today?
Yes, I do it every day, and I've done it since 1970 or so, and before that also.
How long for each day?
Well, there were some periods when I did it an hour or 2 hours a day, or some periods when I went on retreats and did it 8 hours a day for weeks at a time. Now it's fragments and snatches of time, but mixed with other forms of meditation, Vajrayana-style Tibetan Buddhists, which involve visualization and mantra. But I had long experience of just sitting, as it's called, just sitting. Shikantaza in Zen terms, or just shamatha, that's the Sanskrit for quietening the mind, leading to vipassana, which is clear seeing. In other words, if you let the water settle, and the dust settle to the bottom of the fish bowl, and you can see through the fish bowl.
Your father was a poet.
We didn't finish, I don't think, with psychedelics, though. I had
Please.
one footnote. I tried something called ecstasy a few years ago and had a very useful, interesting experience of remembering an old literary enemy whom I'd argued with in my mind like the Blue Meanie for years, and suddenly saying, oh, that good old Blue Meanie. He's been around since I was in college. He's been annoying me, and I've thrown all my thunderbolts at him. He's been working for me all these years and suffering. How can I hate him? It was just this transformation from aggressive resentment to gratitude at having somebody who could define my limits, so to speak, or define what my
This was
objections.
Norman Podhoretz.
Yes, yes. It was very funny, actually. I wrote him about it, but he said, you still don't understand me.
Your
I said,
father was a poet.
the last thing I would say about
sorry.
that is a conversation with the poet Henri Michaud, who said he was not so much interested in what experiences people had on psychedelics, but what they did the next day, how they were to apply, how people were able to apply them in concrete terms, in real, alternative, ordinary mind. Okay, onward and upward.
Onwards and upwards, and I'm trying to ask you about your father being
Yes.
a poet. Was he a good one?
Well, he was quite a great lyric poet, as lyric was understood in those days. Not, lyric comes from the lyre, a stringed instrument. Like Bob Dylan is the perfect lyric poet, and maybe the greatest poet and of this half of the century, and certainly better known than me, incidentally. I'm not the most well-known American poet. I would say Bob Dylan is, and he's a respectable poet, too. But my father wrote what was called lyric, that is without music, without strings, the forms of lyric poetry, rhymed verse. And so I learned that as an apprentice at his knee when I was 5 years old, and can even do spontaneous rhyme, and can do it any time, and can continue as long as I want, and stop when I faint. So there's a family business here involved. He wrote a number of very beautiful poems, which I've echoed, particularly in a poem called Father Death Blues, which was a threnody on his death in 1975, which is one of my favorite poems, and maybe the deepest poem I've written since Kaddish. Except maybe White Shroud is like another long poem, a dream vision poem, in which I meet my mother again in 1983 as a bag lady in New York, and have a chance to take care of her as I hadn't when she was alive.
Did your Jewishness matter to you much when you were young?
Well, my father was socialist, my mother left-wing communist, and they were both agnostics, as they called themselves. And my own Buddhist conclusion is non-theistic. And there is some problem with the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition of an absolute hierarchical old Nobodaddy outside, as Blake calls him. So the Jewish aspect, I think, passed by, though I was interested in Martin Buber and visited him, and who was a great Jewish philosopher and Hasidic expert, and Gershom Scholem, whom I admired a great deal and read a lot of his work, and worked with him trying to determine the names of the eons from Sophia on down to the Garden of Eden. I visited him in Jerusalem in 1961, I think, and saw him again in Paris, and we worked out, for a poem called Plutonian Ode, worked out all the names of the eons and the archons of the eons.
Are you a writer or a performer? Are you best read on the page or heard in performance?
Well, what would you say about Homer? Was he a writer or a performer? He was certainly oral. It wasn't written down till later. What would we say about Sappho, who both wrote and performed? What would we say about Campion, who wrote and performed, or Doland, or Waller, or Waller, whose music was set, or whose poems were set to music? I'm primarily a writer, actually. I conceive poems in my inner ear. But there is a dimension of sound, and there is the preparation in America of a vehicle for idiomatic communication, vernacular communication, using vernacular rhythms and diction. And that's been my specialty, so that it's possible to perform or recite or orate or vocalize, I would say, my poems, and have them understood more rapidly and almost instantaneously, as ordinary speech, or intense fragments of ordinary speech, best.
You write, you treat, you provoke, you mock public themes. You write about America. Has that writing over these years, now collected in a great volume of collected work, with new work still coming out, has that writing had a political effect?
Well, I think it's had some. You know, I saw Bob Dylan a couple of weeks ago, this being, what, December '94, and he was saying, who owns all the money? Who owns the media? As he travels around the world, he notices that all the media change their story every week, that somebody is directing that. And who owns all the money, he was saying. And it was like he knew he had a great deal of power to influence people's psyches or minds or thinking or psychology or opinionation. And yet his own power was minuscule compared to the power of the moguls of the media. And in America, it's only 22 people who own 80% of the mass media. So that it would be very difficult for a poem or a poet to overcome that barrage of bullshit. On the other hand, poetry is the only place where you get an individual person telling his subjective truth, what he really thinks, as distinct from what he wants people to think he thinks, like a politician or someone preparing an editorial in a dignified newspaper. So if you need the historical truth of what people think inside, you have to follow Shelley and his admonition that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the race. Or what Carlos Williams said more acutely was, the government is of words. After all the people making political speeches, they're writing prose, if not poetry, and they're trying to get a little flowery language in there. But the language is shifty, and the language is manipulative. And people who are advertising or even doing ordinary mass media are still inhibited and can't say what they really think. But the poet can say what he really thinks authentically. And that's the advantage, and it's longer lasting than the immediate radio broadcast or television broadcast. Because poem is like a radio that can broadcast continuously for thousands of years. So in the long run, it may have an ameliorating effect on the spirit.
Would the life that you lived in the 50s and 60s and 70s...
Same life I'm leading now, not much different.
Has AIDS affected that life?
Yes, I have to use a condom now. Not that I can get it up to penetrate anybody, because I'm getting 68 and have diabetes, so I'm relatively impotent. So I don't personally need one, but if anybody wants to amuse me, they'd better use a condom.
Who was the love of your life?
Well, a number of people, actually. Many crushes, and I have one a day, doesn't everybody? But Peter Orlovsky, I've lived with, you know, and been related to since 1954. So that's, what is that now, 40 years. And I saw him the day before I left from America to France, actually, a few weeks ago. I had an old boyfriend, or love, that I never slept with as a student, and I still cherish his memory, and we're old friends now. I was in love with Kerouac. I think sexually the most interesting, and emotionally turbulent and painful, pleasurable was Neil Cassidy, with whom I had sort of a funny affair that lasted 20 years, I mean, on and off in bed, naked. So I've had a very fortunate life, actually, in that sense of any fantasy, naive fantasy I had as an adolescent was somewhat satisfied.
As you get older, what do you most fear?
Oh, I think cancer of the rectum, maybe. That is the pain of... Well, I have a one-line poem. Get used to your body. Forget you were born. Suddenly you've got to get out. So the exit from the body, whatever pain there is in that, might be fearful. Just the physical pain, as I'm a coward, basically. Maybe everybody is, but I'm certainly a coward there. I have very good Tibetan Buddhist teachers who give me doctrines on how to leave the body or how to approach death. Very interesting conversations with them, and there's a certain stability in that view. But you know, I'm just a flesh and bones with high blood pressure and a weak heart and some problems with my kidneys.
Both Bob Dylan and Jack Kerouac described you, I think, as a con man extraordinaire. What did they mean?
Oh, maybe they were projecting their own goofiness on me. With Dylan, it's a reference to the trickster hero. You know, I remember last time I saw Dylan was, he asked me about Blake, next to the last time I saw him. He said, do you know the poem that begins, I asked a thief to steal me a peach? And I continued, holy and meek, he cries, I asked a lied lady to lie her down. She turned up her eyes. As soon as I went, along came a thief, and twixt earnest and joke, stole a peach from the tree, and without one word spoke, still as a maid, enjoyed the lady. So it's that question of twixt earnest and joke, I think, which characteristic of Dylan, and somewhat characteristic of Kerouac, certainly.
How would you like us to remember you?
Oh, I think Father Death Blues, the poem Father Death Blues. Maybe I should sing that. Would that be of interest?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, I've mentioned it before. I think it's the fruition of my Buddhist training. When my father died, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, my teacher, said, I extend my thought that your father entered Dharmakaya, empty blue sky. Please let him go and continue your celebration. Hey, Father Death, I'm flying home. Hey, poor man, you're all alone. Hey, old daddy, I know where I'm going. Father Death, don't cry anymore. Mama's there underneath the floor. Brother Death, please mind the store. Old Auntie Death, I hear your groans. Old Uncle Death, I see your bones. Oh, Sister Death, how sweet your moans. Oh, children deaths, go breathe your breaths. Sobbing breaths will ease your deaths. Pain is gone, tears take the rest. Genius Death, your art is done. Lover Death, your body's gone. Father Death, I'm coming home. Guru Death, your words are true. Teacher Death, I do thank you for inspiring me to sing this blues. Buddha Death, I wake with you. Dharma Death, your mind is new. Sangha Death will work it through. Suffering is what was born. Ignorance made me forlorn. Tearful truths I cannot scorn. Father Breath, once more farewell. Birth you gave was no thing ill. My heart is still, as time will tell.